Picture this. It's 50,000 years ago. You're a Neanderthal. Mammoths are trying to kill you. Winter is basically a death sentence, and you just watched your buddy get eaten by something with way too many teeth. You are, understandably, having a rough week. So what do? Do you lie down on a mammoth hide couch and tell a guy with a clipboard about your childhood? No, obviously not. There were no clipboards. There was barely fire. So what did ancient humans actually do when their brains broke a little? Because here's the thing that's going to bug you for the rest of this video. Humans have always had trauma, grief, anxiety, and heartbreak. Therapy as a word is only about 150 years old. So what happened for the other 300,000 years? Did people just suffer in silence? Stick around because the answer is way weirder and honestly kind of beautiful, and also at one point involves a guy drilling a hole in your skull to let the demons out. Yeah. We're getting there. Buckle in. Let's start with the obvious question. Did ancient humans even have the concept of mental health? Like, did a caveman ever sit by the fire and go, I've just been feeling really anxious lately? Almost certainly not in those exact words. But here's the twist. The feelings were absolutely there. Grief doesn't need a vocabulary to exist. Anxiety doesn't politely wait for psychology textbooks to be invented before it starts ruining your sleep. Our brains have been running the same basic hardware for roughly 200,000 years. Same amygdala, same fight or flight, same 3 a.m. spiral about whether that thing you said in front of the whole tribe was weird. The software's just gotten fancier. So the real question isn't, did they have mental health problems? It's, what on earth did they do about it? And the answer, weirdly, starts with a campfire. Seriously. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies, both ancient ones and modern ones that still exist today, keep landing on the same finding. The fire circle was basically group therapy with better ambiance. At the end of the day, once the hunting was done and the immediate danger had passed, people gathered around the fire and they talked. And not just logistics, not just, hey, pass the roasted tuber. Real talk, stories, complaints, jokes, grief. Studies on modern foraging groups like the Juhuansi in the Kalahari show that as much as 80% of nighttime fireside conversation is storytelling and social bonding, not practical planning. That's the ancient world's version of scrolling your phone before bed, except instead of doom scrolling, they were literally processing trauma together as a community. Kind of makes TikTok look pathetic in comparison, honestly. Here's the thing that made this work. They weren't alone. And I don't mean that in a soft greeting card kind of way. I mean it clinically. Loneliness is one of the biggest predictors of poor mental health that we know of today. And ancient humans, for almost the entirety of human history, were never, ever alone. You slept in a group. You ate in a group. You raised kids in a group. If you were sad, 40 people noticed within the hour. There was no slipping through the cracks because there were no cracks. The whole tribe was the safety net. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds nice, but also deeply annoying. Zero privacy. Everyone in your business at all times. And yeah, fair ancient life was not some utopia. It also came with a healthy dose of, the whole village knows you cried at the river yesterday. But from a pure mental health outcomes perspective, constant social contact is basically a superpower. And modern humans, especially in cities, can go entire days without a single meaningful face-to-face conversation. Our ancient ancestors would look at that and go, that's not freedom. That's a punishment. Okay, but campfire chats can only get you so far. What about the actually intense stuff? Trauma, loss, the kind of thing that requires more than vibes and a warm rock to sit on? This is where it gets genuinely fascinating because pretty much every ancient culture independently arrived at some version of the same solution. Ritual. Structured, repeated, symbolic action designed specifically to process pain. Funerals are the obvious one, and they're ancient, like really ancient. There's evidence of deliberate burial practices going back over 100,000 years, with bodies arranged carefully, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with tools they'd supposedly need in an afterlife. That's not practical. Burying a body practically just means dig hole, put body in hole. Arranging it with flowers and pigment and their favorite spear, that's emotional processing. That's saying goodbye. That's, in the most literal sense, a coping mechanism with archaeological proof. And it wasn't just death. Ancient societies built rituals around basically every major life disruption. Puberty, marriage, surviving an illness, coming home from a hunt that went badly wrong. These rites of passage did something really clever. Something modern psychology would later spend 100 years rediscovering and calling narrative therapy. They gave people a structure to move through pain. A before, a during, and an after. You weren't just suffering randomly in a void, you were going through something with a shape, and a community watching you go through it. and a defined moment where everyone agreed, out loud, that you had made it to the other side. Try getting that kind of closure from a self-help podcast. Now let's talk about the people running these rituals, because this is where things get spicy. Shamans. In a huge number of ancient and indigenous cultures, the shaman, or medicine person, or healer, whatever term you want to use, was doing something that looks suspiciously like a therapist's job description, except with way more theatrics. Part priest, part doctor, part psychologist, part guy who's seen some things. The shaman's role often involved entering altered states, sometimes through dance, drumming, fasting, or plant medicines, specifically to access and process difficult emotional or spiritual material on behalf of the community or an individual. Strip away the spiritual framing for a second and look at the actual mechanism: intense sensory experience, guided by a trusted figure, in a safe communal setting aimed at confronting and releasing difficult emotions. That is, structurally, not that different from certain modern trauma therapies that use guided breathing, movement, or altered states to help people access buried feelings. Ancient humans didn't have the neuroscience vocabulary to explain why drumming for 3 hours until you cried helped you feel better. They just knew that it did, and they kept doing it for tens of thousands of years. That's not nothing. That's a very long-running clinical trial with a suspiciously consistent success rate. All right, let's jump forward a bit, because I promised you skull drilling and I am a person of my word. Around 7,000 years ago, and honestly probably earlier, ancient humans across multiple, completely unconnected regions started performing a procedure called trepanation, which is exactly what it sounds like: drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole directly into a living person's skull. And here's the wild part: skeletal evidence shows a huge number of these patients survived. Like, the bone had time to heal around the hole, meaning the person lived for years afterward. Some skulls even show multiple trepanation holes done at different points in that person's life. So people were doing this more than once, voluntarily, presumably. Now, historians debate exactly why they did it. Some cases were clearly medical, treating head injuries or seizures, but a lot of researchers believe trepanation was also used specifically for psychological distress. The idea, in cultures from ancient Peru to prehistoric Europe, was that mental suffering was sometimes caused by something trapped inside the head: a spirit, a pressure, a bad influence, and that opening a hole let it escape. It sounds absolutely insane by modern standards. But here's the thing that should humble us a little. They were, in their own crude, terrifying, no anesthesia kind of way, operating on the belief that psychological pain has a physical cause and a physical treatment. That's not actually that far off from where we ended up. We just swapped the drill for medication and, considerably less permanent brain holes. Progress, but same basic instinct. Something is wrong inside, and we can intervene. Let's slide over to ancient Egypt for a second, because they had their own take, and it's got a genuinely great name: the wandering womb. I'm not kidding. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe a condition later the Greeks would name it hysteria, where they believed the womb could physically move around inside a woman's body and cause emotional distress. Sounds ridiculous, and it absolutely is by modern standards. But here's what's actually interesting. Their treatment for it often involved aromatic substances, rest, and specific rituals meant to coax the womb back into place. Essentially a full-body, symbolic, ritualized care plan for a person in emotional crisis. It was wrong about the biology, but the instinct that suffering deserves a structured, caring response, they got that part right thousands of years before anyone had a diploma in psychology. Ancient Egypt also had a fascinating relationship with dreams, and honestly, so did Mesopotamia. Both cultures believed dreams were a direct line to the gods, and both had entire professional classes of dream interpreters whose job was essentially to sit with a distressed person, listen to what was clearly a symbolic representation of their fears, and help them make sense of it. Sound familiar? That's basically what a modern therapist does with your recurring dream about showing up to school with no pants on. We just took out the god and kept the guy who listens and interprets. Now let's talk about the guy who basically invented the entire idea of talk to me about your feelings and I'll help you figure it out. Ancient Greece. The Greeks get a lot of credit for inventing philosophy, but what people forget is that Greek philosophy, especially Stoicism, was essentially self-help therapy with better sandals. Guys like Epictetus and later Marcus Aurelius weren't writing abstract nonsense for fun. They were writing practical manuals for managing anxiety, grief, anger, and fear. Epictetus, who was literally enslaved for part of his life and became one of history's most influential thinkers on suffering, taught something that sounds almost identical to modern cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not the event that disturbs you, it's your judgment about the event. That sentence, right there, is basically the founding principle of CBT, one of the most widely used forms of therapy on the planet today, and it's over 2,000 years old. Some guy in a toga figured it out before we had the internet, before we had the printing press, before we had ibuprofen. The Greeks also had another trick up their sleeve: catharsis, through theater. Aristotle wrote about how watching tragedy on stage, watching characters suffer, grieve, rage, and fall apart allowed the audience to process their own difficult emotions vicariously and walk away feeling lighter. Sound familiar? That's basically why you cry during a sad movie and somehow feel better afterward. Same mechanism, just with more togas and considerably worse popcorn. There's also a lesser-known Greek practice worth mentioning: the healing temples of Asclepius, the god of medicine. Sick or troubled people would travel, sometimes for days, to sleep overnight in these temples in a practice called incubation. The idea was that the god would visit you in a dream and either heal you directly or reveal what you needed to do. Priests would then help interpret that dream the next morning. Strip away the divine branding one more time, and what you actually have is a dedicated healing space, away from home, away from daily stress, where a trained figure helps you process what's going on in your subconscious. That's a wellness retreat. That's a 2,000-year-old wellness retreat, and people paid in livestock instead of a monthly subscription. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's jump over to ancient China for a moment, because they had a completely different but equally interesting framework. Traditional Chinese medicine, going back well over 2,000 years, never really separated emotional health from physical health in the first place. Emotions were tied directly to specific organs: anger to the liver, grief to the lungs, fear to the kidneys, joy to the heart, which sounds a little mystical on the surface, but functionally meant that a person complaining of persistent sadness or fear wasn't dismissed. They were treated with the exact same seriousness as someone with a physical ailment, using acupuncture, herbal medicine, diet, and movement practices like qigong, specifically aimed at restoring emotional balance. There was no stigma gap where physical illness got real doctors and emotional illness got shrugged shoulders. It was all just health, full stop. Now let's talk about religion for a second, because this is a massive piece of the puzzle people often skip. Across nearly every major ancient and classical religion, there existed some form of confession. Confessing wrongdoing, confessing pain, confessing fear to a higher power, or to a trusted religious figure representing that power. Ancient Babylonian and Assyrian texts include prayers of confession asking gods for forgiveness and relief from psychological suffering, some over 4,000 years old. Egyptian, Hindu, and later Christian and Islamic traditions all built in structured practices: prayer, confession, meditation, penance, specifically designed to give people a mechanism for expressing guilt, fear, and grief, and receiving something back: forgiveness, guidance, relief. That is, again, structurally similar to modern therapy. You show up. You speak your pain out loud to someone trained to receive it. You leave feeling lighter. We just swapped the temple for an office and the deity for a diploma. And speaking of Islamic tradition, this next part genuinely deserves way more credit than it gets. During the Islamic Golden Age around the 9th century, physicians in cities like Baghdad and Cairo built some of the earliest known hospitals with dedicated wards specifically for mental illness, called bimaristans. And this is the part that should really stop you in your tracks. These wards used music, fountains, gardens, and structured social activity as actual treatment, centuries before Europe would even consider that mentally ill people deserved treatment at all instead of chains. A physician named Ahmed ibn Sahl al-Balkhi, writing over 1,000 years ago, described a concept of spiritual and psychological health that separated what he called nafsani, psychological, illness into distinct categories including fear, anger, sadness, and obsession, and proposed specific cognitive-style interventions for each one. that is, essentially an early classification system for mental health conditions with tailored treatment approaches, written 1,000 years before the DSM existed. We like to think of psychiatry as this recent enlightened invention. It was already being formalized while most of Europe still thought mental illness meant you'd upset a witch. Let's talk about something a little more hands-on. Touch, movement, and dance, because ancient humans figured out something modern. Research is only now fully confirming that your body and your mind are not actually separate systems having separate problems. Across cultures, from West African healing dances to indigenous American ceremonies, to the movement and breath work found in ancient Chinese practice, physical, rhythmic, repetitive motion was used specifically as emotional release. Modern neuroscience now backs this up hard. Rhythmic movement, drumming, dancing has been shown to reduce cortisol, the stress hormone, and increase oxytocin, the bonding hormone. Ancient people didn't have a cortisol test. They just noticed that after a big group dance around a fire, everyone seemed less on edge, more connected, more able to sleep that night. So they kept doing it, every generation, for thousands of years. That's not coincidence, that's data, just collected the slow way. Worth mentioning too, many indigenous cultures across North America developed something called the talking circle, a structured group practice where a single object, sometimes a feather, sometimes a stone, is passed around, and whoever holds it speaks, uninterrupted, while everyone else simply listens. No advice, no interruption, no crosstalk, just witnessed, respected speech. If that sounds suspiciously like the exact format of a modern group therapy session, that's because it basically is. The talking circle predates the term group therapy by, conservatively, several centuries, and arguably does the core job just as well, arguably better since nobody's checking their insurance coverage halfway through. Here's something else worth sitting with for a second. Ancient humans generally didn't isolate mental suffering the way we sometimes do today. There wasn't a sharp line between your body is sick and your mind is sick and your spirit is sick. It was often treated as one interconnected thing, which again, modern integrative medicine is basically circling back to right now. This idea that chronic stress affects your gut, your immune system, your sleep, your everything. Ancient healers were essentially treating the whole person by default because they'd never been taught to separate the pieces in the first place. We spent a couple hundred years splitting body and mind into different departments with different doctors, and now some of the cutting-edge research is just putting them back together. Kind of makes you wonder who the ancient ones were exactly. So, with all that said, was it actually good? Should we all just throw out modern therapy and go dance around a fire and confess our sins to a priest and maybe get a small hole drilled in our head for good measure? No. Obviously not. Let's be real for a second. Ancient mental health care, for all its cleverness, had massive gaps. If your suffering didn't fit the tribe's explanatory framework, if you were dealing with something like severe depression, psychosis, or a condition nobody around you had a ritual for, you could be labeled cursed, possessed, or dangerous, and treated horrifically. There was no informed consent for that skull drilling, by the way. There was no confidentiality around the campfire chats either. Everyone knew your business whether you wanted them to or not. Ancient care was communal by necessity, not always by choice, and if your community was unkind, superstitious, or simply small and under-resourced, you could fall through every single crack that did exist. Even the more sophisticated systems, the Greek temples, the Islamic Baimaristans, were still often only accessible to people with money, status, or the right religion. Modern therapy exists specifically because we eventually realized that mental suffering deserves trained, evidence-based, individualized, confidential care, not just whatever your village happened to believe about wandering wombs and trapped spirits that particular century. But here's the real point of this whole video, the thing I actually want you to walk away with. Ancient humans were not stumbling around clueless about mental health just because they didn't have the word therapy. They built entire systems: ritual, community, movement, confession, philosophy, story, dream interpretation, structured listening, specifically engineered to help people survive their own minds. Some of those systems were wildly wrong about the mechanism. Nobody's womb was wandering anywhere, but an enormous number of them were right about the underlying principle. Connection heals, expression heals, structure heals, being witnessed by others in your pain heals. We didn't invent the idea that talking about your feelings helps. We just eventually figured out how to do it more precisely, more safely, and without the drill. And honestly, there's something almost comforting in that, Because it means humans have never actually been broken by the fact that life is hard. Every single generation, going back to the very first humans who ever lost someone they loved or feared something they couldn't explain, found some way to sit with that pain instead of just carrying it alone in silence. The methods changed. The instinct never did. You are, quite literally, descended from people who sat around fires processing their trauma together every single night for hundreds of thousands of years. And that instinct, the pull to talk, to be heard, to not carry it all by yourself, is still sitting right there in your brain today. Whether you're in a therapist's office, venting to a friend over coffee, journaling at 1 a.m., or yes, occasionally screaming into the void of a comment section. So if you've ever felt a little embarrassed about needing to talk to someone about how you're feeling, don't be. You're not doing something new or soft or weak. You're doing the single oldest thing humans have ever done to survive being human. Ancient people just did it with more drums, more gods, more livestock payments, and fewer copays. And if this whole thing made you rethink what getting help actually means, or if you learned even one weirdly specific fact you're now going to bring up at a dinner party completely unprompted, you know exactly what to do down there. See you in the next one.